With the two armies' conflict at a lengthy standstill, she conducted a grand ceremony to pray to the heavens, saying it was to bring blessings upon us Banyue soldiers, Kamo said. Thus, the soldiers' will to kill was whipped up, their battle spirits inflamed, and they defended the city gates to the death. There were arrows, giant boulders, boiling oil, swords, and blades. The slaughter was endless and massive. Yet unexpectedly, just as the fighting was at its peak, this state preceptor suddenly opened the city gates. With the gates open wide, millions of enemy troops swarmed into the city like mad. As the iron cavalry trampled past, the entire walled city instantly became a ritual of blood. Kamo, who was fighting hard against their enemies, went mad with rage when he heard that the state preceptor had opened the gates. But no matter how tough he was, one could not win alone against so many. Kamo gritted his teeth. I only learned right then that she had long been colluding with the enemy general and agreed to let her troops in at that moment. But even if I was destined to die in battle, before I died I was going to kill that traitor no matter what. So I sent a troop of soldiers to charge up the city tower, and we dragged her down and hung her dead over the sinner's pit. Hung on that pole. After the enemy troops passed, the kingdom of Banyue became a dead realm. The state preceptor and the general who died in the battle also became trapped within the ruins, both keeping watch over the other in mutual grudge and hate. So, Shilian said, General Kamo, you lead the Banyue soldiers under you to search for that shadow, the state preceptor, everywhere, and every time you capture her, you hang her dead over the sinner's pit. It won't be enough even if we hang her dead 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, Kamo explained. But she's been apprehending all my soldiers who turned wrath and throwing them in the sinner's pit. She set up a powerful array around the pit that only she herself can break. Once you fall, you can never climb back up. And those of us who have been betrayed by her, these soldiers who died wrongfully in battle, hold a deep resentment that only devouring the flesh and blood of those Yong'an can appease, and thus allow us to slowly pass from this earth with our hatred released. Otherwise, they can only howl into the long nights without absolution. Is that why you keep capturing people to feed them? Shilian asked. What else can we do? Kamo replied. Listen to them wail down below and do nothing. The people you threw down, did you catch them yourselves? Or, we can't stray too far from the kingdom of Banyue. But thankfully, her snakes like to haunt the area and often crawl out of ruins to bite people, and caravans who suffer bites come into the city to look for the Shanyue fern. That mud face in the palace. Was it you who buried him? That's right. The man in the earth was originally planning on stealing the riches of the palace, but all the treasure our kingdom had were cleared out by those Yong'an men 200 years ago. Why did you bury him instead of throwing him down here directly? Shilian asked. There's gotta be fertilizer to grow the ferns, you know, Kamo replied. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to hold the scorpion snakes back. We don't want to run into those creatures either. That's not right, Shilian thought. If Kamo and his party consciously knew to grow and fertilize Shanyue ferns, going as far as using live humans as fertilizer, then it was clear that even though they were no longer alive, their fear of those scorpion snakes was still strong. In that case, that fear must have been even greater while they were alive. If that Banyue state preceptor could control a murder weapon as great as those scorpion snakes, then how was she so easily dragged down the city tower by a bunch of soldiers and hanged to death? According to Kamo, in the past 200 years or so, he had captured the state preceptor over and over and hanged her dead repeatedly. Either way, Shilian felt that if it were him, and he had such a killing weapon in his hands, he would never allow the enemy the chance to come near him. And regarding the scorpion snakes that slither out of the ruins to bite people, was that an accident? Not likely. It was more likely that they were purposely trying to lure people into the pass than was the state preceptor doing so intentionally? Wouldn't that only be helping Kamo catch live humans to feed his soldiers? Mutual hatred wouldn't make sense. Were they pretending to be enemies then? What was the point in that? And in all of this mess, there was also the mysterious lady in white and her companion. Shilian decided to ask more questions. General Kamo, when we first entered the city, we saw two ladies, one in white and the other in black. Do you know who they are? Before there was a response, San Lang whispered, "Shh." Shi Lian didn't know what was going on, but he closed his mouth immediately. A strange hunch made him look up. It was the same framed dark blue sky with a crescent moon, but next to the moon he saw a person. A small, black-clad silhouette was peering over the edge and looking down. After watching them for a bit, the little form suddenly grew bigger. It had jumped down. As the figure fell, Shi Lian could see clearly that it was the state preceptor who had been hanging from the pole earlier. "Kamo, what's going on?" the state preceptor asked in the Banyue tongue as she landed. The moment she spoke, Shi Lian thought her voice was very different from what he had imagined. Although it certainly sounded somber, her voice was tiny. It was like the muttering of a sulky child, not cool or powerful at all. If not for his good hearing, Shi Lian might not have even heard her properly. "What's going on? They're all dead!" Kamo shouted. "How did they die?" the state preceptor asked. "Isn't it because you pushed them all down and trapped them in this godforsaken place?" "Who's here?" "There's another person," the state preceptor said. There actually should have been 2 people at the bottom of the pit beside Kamo, but San Lang had neither breath nor heartbeat, so the state preceptor didn't detect his presence. It was also complete chaos on top of the walls earlier, and no one had kept track of who fell and who ran away, so she thought there was only Shi Lian. "They're the ones who killed all my soldiers. Are you happy now? They're all finally dead." The state preceptor was silent. Suddenly, a tiny burst of light flared, illuminating a small, black-clad girl conjuring up a palm torch. The girl surprisingly appeared to be only 15 or 16. She was dressed in plain black cultivator robes, and her eyes were gloomily black as well. She was not unbeautiful, just unhappy. Her forehead and cheeks were covered with bruises, clear and distinct under the light. If it hadn't been confirmed earlier, no one would believe that the state preceptor of Banyue could be such a pale, young girl. The flames in her hand illuminated half her surroundings. At her feet, there were the armored corpses of Banyue soldiers. Shi Lian couldn't help but sneak a glance beside him. The palm torch in the state preceptor's hand was very small and did not light up the entire pit, so they were still immersed in darkness. But borrowing the small light, Shi Lian could still see the red-robed figure beside him. Perhaps it was his imagination, but although San Lang had already been taller than him before, he now appeared even taller somehow. Shi Lian's gaze slowly moved upward and came to the youth's throat. He stopped for a moment, then continued upward, his eyes stopping at an elegantly sloped chin. The features of San Lang's upper face were still hidden in the shadows, but Shi Lian thought the bottom half was subtly different from before. No less handsome, but the lines were much more defined. Feeling he was being watched, San Lang tilted his head, and his lips curled upward slightly. Perhaps he wanted so much to get a better look, to get nearer, that without thinking it, Shi Lian took a step closer to him. Just then Kamo wailed in the distance, seemingly in shock after seeing the bloody tragedy before him. Shi Lian abruptly snapped out of it, and turned to look, and saw Kamo clutching his own head. Despite the general's cries, the state preceptor's expression remained wooden, and she only nodded. Good. In the midst of mourning, hearing those words made Kamo rage once more. Good? What's good? What do you mean? Good means we're finally free, the state preceptor said. She turned to Shi Lian, who was still shrouded in the dark. Are you the one who killed them? It was an accident, Shi Lian replied. You're lying through your teeth, Kamo explained. Shi Lian responded bold-faced. Life is full of accidents. The state preceptor gave him a look, but her expression was unreadable. Who are you? Her words were spoken in perfect Han dialect, and weren't said in an interrogative tone. I'm a heavenly official. This one here is my friend, Shi Lian replied. Kamo couldn't understand their words, but could tell they weren't fighting, and demanded, What are you two saying? The state preceptor looked Shi Lian over and eyed San Lang for a moment before quickly looking away. We've never had heavenly officials visit before. I thought you all already abandoned this place. Shi Lian had expected that they would have to fight the state preceptor of Banyue, but was surprised to find her this despondent and devoid of any will to fight. she continued. Do you two want to leave? Of course we do, but there's an array set in this pit, so we can't, Julienne said. Hearing this, the state preceptor walked to one of the walls, raised her hand, and drew something. She then turned around and said, There, I released the array. You two can leave now. This was too easy. Julienne really didn't know what to say. Just then a voice called from above, Hey, is anyone down there? If not, I'm leaving. It was Fu Yao's voice. Julienne heard Sanlong tusk next to him, and immediately looked up. There was a shadow of a man looking down into the pit. Julienne shouted, Fu Yao, there are people down here. I'm down here. He waved, and Fu Yao shouted back from above, You're actually down there? What's at the bottom besides you? A lot of things. Why don't you come down and see for yourself? Julienne said. Fu Yao probably thought the same, and with a loud rumble, he hurled a large ball of fire into the pit. In an instant, the entire sinner's pit was lit up, bright like day, and Julienne finally saw clearly the kind of place he'd been standing in. All around him were mountains of bloody corpses piled high, innumerable bodies of Banyue soldiers stacked on top of each other, faces and limbs blackened, dark blood smearing their bright armor. The corner where Julienne stood was the only spot in the entire sinner's pit that did not have a dead body. This was all done in a flash, in the dark, by Sanlong after he jumped in. Julienne turned to gaze at the youth next to him. Before, in the dark, he vaguely saw that Sanlong looked taller and subtly different in certain features, but now, under the bright firelight, the one standing next to him was the same handsome youth he knew. When he saw Julienne looking over, he smiled. Julienne looked down to check his wrists and boots, and both were also the same as before, having nothing that would cause any jingling sound. Just then, Julienne heard a muffled noise. It was the sound of Fu Yao jumping down. Weren't you looking after the merchants? Julienne asked. Having just entered the pit, Fu Yao wasn't yet used to the stench of blood and fanned his hand to make the air flow. He replied indifferently, We waited for over 6 hours and there was still no sign of you, so we figured something had happened. I drew a circle for them to wait in and came to check on things myself. Julienne frowned. The circle won't last long. With you gone, what if they leave the circle thinking you left them behind? Fu Yao shrugged. 8 horses can't pull back a man who really wants to seek death. I can't stop stubborn people, so I won't try. What's with those 2 over there? Who's who? Fu Yao is on high alert, his guard raised against the 2 unknowns. But as soon as he discovered in astonishment that Keimo was already heavily wounded on the ground, barely able to stand, and the state preceptor of Banyue was quiet, with her head hung low. That one is the general of Banyue. The other one is the state preceptor of Banyue. Right now, Keimo suddenly leapt up before Julienne could finish. He had been lying on the ground gathering his strength and was finally able to jump up with a shout, aiming his fists at the state preceptor of Banyue, a large, beefy warrior attacking a little girl. Normally, Julienne would never have allowed that sort of thing to happen before him. But Keimo had every right to hate the state preceptor, and she could defend herself perfectly well. However, she didn't, and allowed herself to be thrown around like a broken rag doll. Keimo shouted at the state preceptor, Where are your scorpion snakes? Come on, let them bite me to death too! Give me that release! The state preceptor gloomily replied, Keimo, my snakes don't listen to me anymore. Then why don't they kill you? He scoffed. I'm sorry, Keimo. The state preceptor apologized softly. Do you really hate us that much? The state preceptor shook her head, and Keimo became angrier. You're going to be the death of me. If you don't hate us, why did you betray us? You shameless spy, disgusting mole, traitor! Fu Yao watched him strike harder and harder. The blows were all single-sided, and he couldn't help but frown. What are they saying? Shouldn't we stop them? Julienne couldn't watch anymore either, and rushed forward to stop Keimo. General, why don't you tell us who that Yong'an thug really is, and will... Suddenly, the state preceptor seized his wrist. The grip was hard and came unexpectedly, and Julienne's heart dropped, thinking she was going to attack him. But when he looked back down at her, the state preceptor was on all fours on the ground. There was a small bruise at the corner of her mouth, and her head was raised, staring at him intently. She didn't say a single word, but her dark eyes were intense with the fire of life. This demeanor overlapped with an image from a far-gone memory. After a pause, Julien blurted, "It's you?" The state preceptor also called, "General Hua." This back and forth stunned everyone in the pit. Fu Yao rushed forward, knocked out Keimo with a punch, and demanded, "You two know each other." Julien didn't have the time to answer him, however. He knelt down, gripped the shoulders of the state preceptor, and examined her face. They'd been standing too far apart before, and he couldn't see clearly. Plus, it had been over 200 years. This girl had matured in that time, and for many reasons he didn't recognize her at first. But now that he looked again properly, it was the same face from his memories. Julien couldn't speak for the longest time, and it was a good moment before he sighed. "Banyue?" The state preceptor quickly clutched at his sleeves, surprisingly a little excited. "It's me! General Hua! Do you still remember me?" "Of course I remember you, but..." Julien gazed at her for a moment and sighed. "But what have you done to yourself?" When she heard that, the state preceptor's eyes suddenly filled with pain. "I'm sorry, Captain. I messed up," she muttered. In that exchange, there was General this, Captain that, making it glaringly obvious to the bystanders. Fu Yao was dumbstruck. "Captain? General? You? How did this happen?" "Then the tomb of the general is..." Julien nodded. "My tomb." "Didn't you say you only came to collect scraps 200 years ago?" Fu Yao questioned. "This is a long story. That was originally the plan," Julien answered. "Around 200 years ago, due to certain reasons, Julien couldn't muck around in the east anymore, and decided to stay out of sight for a while. He had planned to come across the Qing Ridge and head to the south to start a brand new life of scraps. Thus, he took up his compass and walked southward. But the more he walked, the more he thought woefully, why was the scenery all wrong? There should have been an abundance of trees and greenery, cities and life. So how come his path was becoming more and more desolate? However, Julien pushed his suspicions aside and stubbornly continued. He walked and came upon the Gobi Desert. It took a gust of wind blowing a fistful of sand in his face for Julien to finally realize that his compass had long been broken. The direction it guided him that entire journey was wrong. Since there wasn't anything he could do about the whole thing, he thought that he might as well take this chance to visit the desert scenery. So he continued onward. The only difference was that he changed course slightly at the last minute for a destination to the northwest, and finally arrived at the border, where he temporarily settled near the kingdom of Banyue. At first I was just collecting junk or something in the area," Julien said. "But the border was troubled, and with so many skirmishes, there were often runaway soldiers, so the army would draft anyone to make up the numbers." "So you were forced into the army?" Sanlong asked. "Yeah," Julien replied. "But doing anything was more or less the same, so it didn't matter to me. And then after chasing away some bandits a couple of times, I somehow got promoted to captain. The ones who gave me face would call me general, too." "Why did she call you General Hua?" Fu Yao questioned. "Your surname isn't Hua." Julien waved his hand and said dismissively, "Don't worry about it. I randomly made up a fake name at the time. I think it was Hua Shi." Hearing the name, Sanlong's face changed slightly, his lips faintly twitching. Julien didn't notice and continued. "With a battle-torn border came many orphans. When I was free, I'd play with them sometimes. One of them was named Banyue." When there were bandits, Julien was surely the bravest soldier, and no one dared to block his way, nor even dared to stand beside him. But when there weren't, it was as if anyone could order him around. One day he went and sat by a wall to start a campfire, using his own helmet to cook. As he cooked, the smell of it drifted out, and a few enraged soldiers came and kicked over whatever it was he was cooking. Julien picked up his helmet with a broken heart. But when he looked back, he saw a small, disheveled, grimy child crouching behind him. She was picking up the stuff knocked to the ground with her bare hands and stuffing it into her mouth without caring whether it was too hot. He was shocked. "Don't! Wait, little kid, you..." As expected, the little kid scarfed down a few lumps of the stuff she had picked up off the ground, and then dry-heaved harshly, crying loudly. Julien was so shaken that he didn't pick Shilian was so shaken that he picked her upside down and ran laps until all the stuff she ate came back out. After that was done, he crouched down and wiped his sweat. "Are you all right, little one?" "I'm sorry, but don't ever tell your parents about this. And next time, don't pick up any more random stuff off the ground to eat." "Wait, what are you doing now?" The child's face was covered in tears, but she still went to pick food off the ground again, wanting to eat. It was only after Shilian grabbed her that he realized the skin of the child's stomach was practically pressed to the back of her bones. When people were starved to that point, anything could be eaten. Even if it was disgusting to the point of tears, she would still eat it. Shilian had no choice and went to get the last of his rations. After that incident, he would often see the child stalking him in the shadows nearby. In his memories, the little girl Banyue was always gloomy. Her body and face were covered in bruises, and when she looked at him, she would clutch the hem of his clothes and stare at him just so from below. She was singled out by the children of Banyue Kingdom. Besides Shilian, only a particular Yong'an boy living at the border would sometimes pay attention to her. She'd spend her days tagging along behind the two of them. She rarely spoke, but she was fluent in the Han dialect, so Shilian didn't know where she came from. But she was a random wandering child, so he randomly took her in. When he was free, sometimes he'd teach her songs, sometimes wrestle, sometimes show off his busker move, shattering boulders on one's chest, and other stuff. And they got along quite well. Shilian shook his head. "I had thought the Banyue in the state preceptor's title was the country. I didn't realize it was actually the name of the state preceptor." "And then?" Fu Yao asked. "And then it's pretty much the same as what the memorial wrote," Shilian said. After the silence, Sanlong spoke up. "The memorial said you died." As for that memorial, Shilian was extremely bummed out. Weren't memorials usually full of praise and exaggerated good deeds to glorify the deceased? All those mentions of his demotions aside, why did it have to so seriously record the embarrassing way he died? While they were hiding away from the sandstorm, and he read to this part, he could barely look at it straight on. If it wasn't for Sanlong, who also understood the Banyue script and was watching him, he would have pretended that section never existed. Having something like that written down, even he wanted to laugh at it. Never mind other people. And he didn't even have the nerve to ask those seeking shelter in his memorial not to laugh as they commented and joked about his epitaph. That made him feel really bummed. Shilian's forehead was becoming red from all the rubbing. "Oh, that. Of course I didn't die. I faked it." Fu Yao had a face full of disbelief. Shilian explained himself. "I got trampled too hard and couldn't get up, so there wasn't any option besides faking my death." Truthfully, Shilian couldn't quite remember exactly how he died, nor why that battle broke out in the first place, only that it was over something petty. He really hadn't wanted to fight, and victory or defeat was meaningless. But by then his rank could go no lower, and no one would listen to him. In the midst of battle, everyone saw red, so when he rushed out and both sides saw it was him, for some reason all the blades and swords went after him and cut him down. Fu Yao questioned. He must have been standing in the middle, being an eyesore, and that raised the ire of both sides, right? Otherwise, why would people cut you down on sight? Besides, I'm sure you knew there were many who hated you, so why didn't you avoid them? Why did you have to charge in? I'm sure you could have avoided the whole thing if you wanted to." "I really don't remember, all right," Shilian said. Even if nothing could kill him, he still couldn't endure that kind of butchering. So, with the thought, "This can't go on," Shilian resolutely dropped to the ground and faked his death. But even in death, he was trampled to the point of passing out. It was water choking him that roused him. Because corpses were usually thrown into the river after battles, Shilian went with the river's flow and floated back to the kingdom of Yong'an like a heap of junk. Afterward, he took several years to recover from his wounds, then picked up an unbroken compass to start off anew, and finally made it to his original destination in the south. He then stopped paying attention to what went on in the kingdom of Banyue. "I'm sorry," Banyue muttered again. Fu Yao furrowed his brow. "Why does she keep apologizing to you?" Sanlong suddenly spoke up. Kimo stated that the state preceptor of Banyue left for the Central Plains after a clash between the two armies. Were you involved in that? With that reminder, and recalling what was written on the memorial, some things were coming back to Shilian, though only in bits and pieces. Maybe? It was to save me, Banyue said. Everyone turned to look at her, and she said softly, "General Hua got flattened because he entered the fray to save me." Shi Lian instantly remembered the agony of being trampled by thousands, and he hugged his body despite himself. But when he saw two others watching him with unreadable expressions, he pulled himself back in a hurry. He said, "Not flat, not too flat." Who knew why Fu Yao was looking so smug? He said passive-aggressively, "Well, aren't you a saint?" Shi Lian waved dismissively. "Nothing of the sort. I don't remember the specifics anymore, but there were two children playing at the time, and I was just going to pick them up and run away immediately, but we didn't manage to retreat fast enough and got caught between the two armies." "If that's the case," Fu Yao demanded, "how can you not remember something like that?" Shi Lian replied, "Do you not know how many hundreds of years old I am? So much can happen in just a decade. There's no way to remember everything in detail. Besides, some things are best forgotten. Rather than remembering how I was butchered and trampled hundreds of years ago, I'd prefer to remember that I ate a delicious meat bun yesterday. No?" "I'm sorry," Ban Yue said. Shi Lian sighed. "Ban Yue, saving you was my own choice. You're not at fault. If you're going to apologize, perhaps it should be to others." Ban Yue was taken aback and hung her head in silence. Shi Lian continued, "But maybe it's because my impression of you is from 200 years ago. But I don't think you're the kind of child who'd seek revenge on others. Will you tell me what happened exactly? Why did you open the city gates?" Ban Yue contemplated, shook her head, and remained silent. "Then why did you let the snakes out to bite people?" Shi Lian asked. This time, Ban Yue answered, "I didn't release the snakes." Shi Lian was taken aback. "What?" "I didn't release the snakes," Ban Yue repeated. "They ran off on their own. I don't know why, but they don't listen to me anymore." Hearing this, Fu Yao grew impatient. Ban Yue pleaded, "General Hua, I'm not lying." Before Shi Lian responded, Fu Yao cut in rudely. "Anyone would say that after being captured. Even if you say it wasn't intentional, I've heard all that before. All those people crossing the pass were clearly injured by your snakes. Show me your hands. You're under arrest." Ban Yue shut up and extended both arms. Fu Yao immediately took out an immortal binding rope and apprehended both Ban Yue and Keimo. Then he said, "All right, we've accomplished our goal for this trip. It's all over now." Just then, San Lang spoke up. She had no reason to lie. Shi Lian also felt there was a need for further interrogation. He turned to Ban Yue. "Can you not control any of your snakes?" Ban Yue answered, "I can control them, and they'll obey me most of the time, but there are times when they won't. I don't know why." After some thought, Shi Lian said, "Why don't you call them out to show us?" Ban Yue was kneeling before him. Now she finally rose to her feet and nodded. Soon, a wine-red scorpion snake slithered out from underneath a corpse, raised its head, and curled itself on a pile of dead bodies. It soundlessly flicked its tongue at the group. Shi Lian was about to take a closer look at the snake, but saw Ban Yue widen her eyes. Face strange. Shi Lian's heart dropped, and he thought, "Oh no." As that thought crossed his mind, the snake stopped flicking its tongue, opened its mouth, and pounced in attack. It was a sudden lunge, but Shi Lian was ready. He was about to grab for it when, boom, something exploded. When he opened his eyes again to see, the snake was already a splatter of guts on the ground, having been thoroughly blown apart. It was a calculated blast, too, since none of the venom spilled. Shi Lian immediately remembered another time when a snake died like that before they entered the Ban Yue ruins, but there was no need to say who did it at this point. He hadn't even had the chance to look at San Lang before a red sleeve flashed before him, barring and separating him from Ban Yue. On the other side, Fu Yao said coldly, "I knew she was lying. Did you think the snake would manage to bite him under these circumstances? Foolish." Ban Yue's face was already pale when she saw that snake, and when she heard him, her head shot up. "I didn't do it! I said there are some snakes that don't obey me, and that was one of them just now." Fu Yao didn't believe a single word. Who knows whether it was disobeying or obeying you? "That one wasn't even called forth by me," Ban Yue said glumly. Shi Lian was about to speak when another two wine-red scorpion snakes poked out from under a different corpse, flicking their tongues and watching them intently. A third, a fourth, a fifth, from the mountains of dead bodies, every corner of the pit, there came innumerable scorpion snakes. Everyone stared at Banyue, who was kneeling on top of a pile of corpses, and Fu Yao started spinning a ball of spiritual energy in his palm and shouted at her, "Make them go away! They can't all disobey!" Banyue scrunched up her brows, looking as if she was trying to drive them out. Yet more scorpion snakes appeared, curling and crawling, slithering ever closer. Bites from 1 or 2 snakes might not kill them, but from hundreds or thousands was harder to say. Even if they didn't die, it wouldn't be pretty. Shilian raised his wrist, about to call forth Roya, but saw that when the snakes slithered to a certain distance, they would stop and hesitate, forming a weird circle. It dawned on Shilian, and he glanced at Sanlong next to him. He was watching the snakes with condescension and immense contempt. The scorpion snakes seemed to be able to read his eyes and didn't dare approach. They backed off bit by bit, lowering their heads as they did so, pressing their savage heads against the ground submissively, like servants. But there seemed to be another power controlling them, not allowing them to abandon their attacks and leave completely. Thus many of the snakes turned around and slithered toward Fu Yao. Fu Yao swung his hand and a blast of fire burst from his sleeve, killing a circle of snakes and forcing back another. That wouldn't last long, however. Shilian said, "Let's get out of here first." Whoosh. Roya shot out from Shilian's arm and flew upward. But a moment later, another whoosh, and it was back on Shilian's arm. Shilian was slightly taken aback and raised his wrist, scolding the silk band, now rewrapped around it. "What are you doing back here? The array was released. There's nothing stopping you anymore. Hurry and go." But Roya remained wrapped around his arm, trembling, as if it had bumped into something terrifying at the top. Shilian was about to coax it some more when suddenly a long rope of something fell. Plop. It dropped on Fu Yao's shoulder. Fu Yao went to grab it, and his face changed the moment he brought it before his eyes. It was another scorpion snake that fell from the sky. This caught Fu Yao off guard, and after getting bitten, he hurled the snake toward Banya. Even with her hands tied, she still reflectively tried to catch the snake. And after having caught it, the dark red snake curled itself up around her arm, without attacking. Just then, another plop, and a second scorpion snake landed on the ground. Shilian could guess why Roya refused to go up now. Borrowing the faint light of the moon, Shilian raised his head and only just barely saw the sight. Hundreds of little wine-red dots were falling rapidly into the sinner's pit. A snake dolge. The wine-red dots were coming closer. Shilian yelled, "Fu Yao, fire! Shoot a stream of fire upward and get rid of them while they're still in the air!" Fu Yao bit his palm to break the skin, swung his hand, and a series of blood drops shot out. An instant later, they transformed into a screen of fire that jetted up through the pit. Those sweeping flames rose over 30 meters and hung in the air, disintegrating all scorpion snakes that touched them, burning them to ash, dissolving the snake dolge. Temporarily safe, Shilian let out a breath of relief. "That was good, Fu Yao. Thank goodness for you." A spell like that evidently consumed an immense amount of spiritual power, and after one round, Fu Yao's face was pale. He turned around and ignited a ring of fire, dispelling the snakes on the ground, and shouted at Banyue, "And you say those snakes don't obey you? If you weren't controlling them, then why wouldn't they attack you?" Sanlong laughed. "Maybe it's because of your bad luck. They didn't attack us, either." Fu Yao turned to look at him, eyes sharp and narrowed. Shilian could sense trouble. He'd somewhat established a theory about the current situation, but hadn't yet had the time to sort out his thoughts, and Shilian didn't want to see the two of them start fighting now. "Let's figure out what's going on with those snakes first," Shilian said. Let's charge out." Fu Yao sneered. "What's going on? Either the state preceptor of Banyue is lying, or the one next to you is causing trouble." Shilian glanced at Banyue, then at Sanlong, and said, "I don't think it's either of them." His tone was gentle but firm. It was the conclusion he had come to after much thought. However, Fu Yao must have thought he was shielding them intentionally, and the face illuminated by flames was unkind. Shilian couldn't tell if he was angry or laughing. "Your Royal Highness," Fu Yao said, "don't play pretend when you know the truth. Do you still remember your place? I'm sure you're already very aware of who exactly that cad next to you is. I refuse to believe you haven't realized it." And that's chapter 9.